My task really is just to set the scene on giving you some numbers and some context on productivity and what's been happening to productivity, and why it matters for us as an economy. What is it? This is the nerdy explanation. Normally, we measure productivity these days by output or value added per hour or per worker, but it's basically the value of our national output, our GDP or our GVA, divided by the number of people or the number of hours taken to produce it. And ultimately, it matters to everybody because it is the ultimate determinant of living standards. As Paul Krugman, now known more as a provocative New York Times columnist than as a Nobel Prize-winning economist, put it, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. So it's one of the most important concepts in economics and in determining economic growth. It's the explanation for why living standards rise, or when they don't, why they're not rising. And if we look at it, what is the problem? What is the puzzle we have at the moment? In normal times, the UK and most other advanced economies had productivity growth of around about 2% a year in the post-war era. And you may remember that the 2% a year was considered to be not as good as we could do. I mean, Gordon Brown, when he took over as Chancellor in 1997, established his productivity agenda and brought in lots of experts to try and advise on how we could raise productivity growth from that 2% a year. So even 2% a year was not considered to be as good as we could do. But since the financial crisis, we've had barely any growth in productivity at all. So there has been a definable and serious problem. Now, we know that productivity is cyclical. When output is rising strongly, when growth is strong, productivity tends to rise strongly as well, and vice versa. But it's clearly the case, looking through those cyclical changes, that it has weakened substantially since the crisis. This is the point about what we would normally expect productivity to do, which, as I say, is to grow by around about 2% a year, and what it has done over the past 8 or 9 years, which is record virtually no growth at all. And the link between that and living standards is pretty well established. So if we look at those two lines, real GDP per head is one way we might measure living standards, and labour productivity. It is they're pretty closely matched. And you think of that within any organisation. What determines whether an organisation can offer a real wage increase, pay rising by more than inflation? And in essence, it's productivity that drives that. So it's the reason why we've seen wage stagnation since the crisis, alongside this productivity stagnation. I mentioned that the current government is concerned about this, and all governments in the end are concerned about productivity, and when it is weak, they are even more concerned. But this is from the March budget. March budget is probably remembered for other reasons, but this was one of the few charts that they put in the document, just to show that it matters, and that, as I say, an important part of this government's agenda is to improve the productivity record, is to raise productivity growth, and to improve on the performance, the pretty abject performance of recent years. Sometimes when I talk to ministers and you talk to civil servants, they will say, well, maybe it wasn't so bad. We've had terrible growth in productivity in recent years, but we've had this very strong growth in employment. This is the employment rate, and it is very high. The employment rate, the data we've got for the employment rate goes back to 1971, and it has never been higher than it is now. But I think that tells us two things. One, that itself is a minor miracle, because if you think about it, we're talking about the 16 to 64 age group. A lot of people within that age group, particularly at the younger end, no longer come into the workforce because they stay on longer at school. They go to university and so on. Many more than did in the 1970s. But the bad news about this is that it's probably quite difficult to get much higher than an employment rate of just below 75%, which we've got at the moment. So you can't continually rely on expanding the employed workforce to improve, to raise GDP. Sooner or later, you have to address the productivity problem. So this has served us, weak productivity has served us in reasonably good stead in terms of generating quite strong employment growth for the past few years, but that cannot be a long-term and sustainable solution to the problem of how do you drive economic growth. So it's important to raise productivity.